Hey guys, welcome back to the B&B Farmers Maple channel. You know, in a recent video we talked about small engine troubleshooting, specifically ignition non-starting issues on a small engine. Today we're going to expand that into the fuel system. So we've got a Kawasaki here on this DR mower. Let's get this air cleaner off and we will get down to it. Thanks guys, we're glad you're here. You can see that I have removed not just the air cleaner, but also all of the shroud, the plastic that went around the top of the flywheel here. Makes it just easier to get down into everything and see what's going on. So, we're going to troubleshoot a non-starting engine. We think it might be a fuel issue. Where do we begin? Here we go. So right here is the fuel line that runs to the fuel pump. This is our fuel pump right here. This is the fuel line that runs to it. You can see this line runs down through the fuel filter all the way back up into our fuel tank. So number one, we're going to take this line loose at the fuel pump. Get that clamped off, shove it off, and gasoline should pour out of this just through gravity from the fuel tank on down if we get the end lower than the tank. How about that? Nothing's coming out. Now I happen to know that this machine has a fuel shut-off in the bottom of the tank, and it is on. So now I'm going to do something maybe a little unorthodox. Now I'm going to blow back through this fuel line and listen for it bubbling in the tank. That'll tell me if this fuel line is open, because there should be fuel running out of it. Did you guys hear that? I didn't hear any bubbling, but I did hear air escaping out of that fuel tank. That tells us three things. This fuel line that runs to the tank is open. You know, we can blow right through it into the tank. The vent in the top of the fuel cap, I'll show you that right here. On this one, it's just simply a hole drilled in it. The vent is clear, otherwise we wouldn't hear air escaping out of it. But most importantly, we didn't hear any bubbling in the fuel tank, which means there's no gas in this tank. Let's take care of that first. All right, we've put gas in the tank. Let's see if it flows freely out of the fuel line that runs to the pump. Yep, so we know the problem is not in our fuel tank. It's not in our line that runs from the fuel tank to the fuel pump. That includes the fuel filter. You know, you saw the gas flowing freely out of that. But what about the fuel pump itself? How do we check that? We're going to start by taking the line loose from the fuel pump to the carburetor. And we'll take it loose right at the carburetor. Just going to loosen this clamp. I'm going to pull that off. Also, something that I want to do is I want to pull both of my spark plug leads off. We're just going to bump this engine over. We don't want it to start, so we're going to pull both plug wires off. Do the same over here. Now, we've got our spark plug wires pulled off, and we've got the fuel line isolated. So I'm going to bump the engine over, just a couple bumps. I'm going to hold this fuel line down in this jar. We're going to see if any gas comes out. That'll tell us if the fuel pump is working. Here we go. Well, there you go. We got good, fuel flow coming from the fuel pump. So the problem is not in the fuel pump, it's not in the line from the fuel pump to the carburetor. That means our issue, if we have a fuel issue, is in the carburetor. We'll go there next. All right, we're gonna take these nuts off that hold the carburetor on. Take off the washers that I added just to keep from tearing the gasket up when I put those nuts back on for this test. There we go. We want to reuse that gasket, so we'll take it off in one piece. Now, we've got to get this carburetor off of here. Here is a bowl vent line. We'll just pull it out. It just sits through a hole in a bracket down here. You see these linkage rods are still hooked up. And I'm going to try to do this without having to get down in this bracket and undo these. So we'll see how that works out. Sometimes we can do it, sometimes we can't. You just got to turn the carburetor and work it around the Z-bends that are bent in the end. There's one. That was the choke rod. And here is the throttle rod. Got a spring hook to it. There it is. We've got our carburetor off. We'll take off the gasket that joins the carburetor to the block, because again, we're going to reuse that. And we will dive into what makes a carburetor tick. Once we have our carburetor off, we've got to take the float bowl off. So we're going to loosen the bowl nut right here. Oh, might be a little fuel in it. I don't know, there wasn't much. We'll see. If there is, we'll catch it. I think we're all right. Get rid of that. Now, something I want to talk about. On some engines, it's not just a nut that holds this float bowl on. There's what they call a fuel solenoid, which is a metal cylinder, probably about, so long. It's got a wire coming out of it, maybe 2 wires, maybe a connection for a wire to plug into it. Either way, it does the same thing. Its function is to prevent a backfire on that engine when you turn the key off. That's why you're only going to see that fuel solenoid on a machine that has an electrical system, like battery starting, a charging system, because it needs power to activate that fuel solenoid. It's just a big electromagnet. When you turn the key on to the run position, there's a plunger in that solenoid that closes off the fuel. And when you turn the key on, that plunger goes, pulls back, lets fuel flow internally in the carburetor so the engine will run. And when you turn the key off, that spring-loaded plunger springs up and shuts off the fuel. You've all heard the engines, or I'm assuming you have, that when you turn the key off, maybe you get off the seat, take a couple of steps away from it, and it backfires real loud. That's what a fuel solenoid, it's what it's there for, is to prevent that from happening. So, just a little added info. All right, so let's take our float bowl off, trying not to tear the gasket up. There we go. Got a little bit of crud down in there, not bad. But the part that we're worried about is right here. See that little jet? And right up in there. And I'm going to try to get those out for you guys. You got to have a screwdriver that fits that thing just perfect, because it's soft brass and you will tear it up. We're going to unscrew that. We're going to put it down in there so we keep track of it. We're going to do the same thing to the one down in here. If it won't come out, don't force it. All right. There's another jet right there. I'm going to drop that down. I don't know if you can see down in there or not, but there's actually another threaded jet underneath the first one. Let's see if we can get it out. I think it turned. I can't begin to tell you how delicate these are. That brass is so soft. Once we unscrew it most of the way, we should be able to get a hold of it. There, that's the main fuel nozzle. All right, now let's go get something to clean this with, and I'll show you how to determine where the problem is. So I don't know if you can see this or not. I'm going to hold it up. You guys see the hole in that? Maybe the camera get up in there and see that hole. That's a pretty good sized hole. So there's not normally going to be a problem in that big piece right there. But this little piece right here, this is where most of the carburetor issues come from. This little jet, and the hole in it, I know you're not going to be able to see that. It is super tiny in there. So what we're going to do, I think this may even be too big. This is a torch tip cleaner, like you would clean the tip on an oxyacetylene torch. We're going to take the finest wire that we can find in it, and it still may be too big. We're going to try to go through that jet. We did it. See that? We want to make sure that tiny little hole in there is open. And we can clean it, but be careful. These torch tip cleaners have like a file on them. You don't want to enlarge that tiny hole. That's not the objective. You just want to make sure there's nothing lodged in it. You want to clean it. So be gentle when you run that wire through it. there we go. Now this carburetor had nothing wrong with it, so you know I knew there was nothing in it, but I have pulled these jets out before and seen them completely stopped up, especially if the engine has been sitting without running for any length of time at all. You know, fuel doesn't have a very long shelf life anymore, and it will gum these up, so remember that. You might see another jet right here. This is an air bleed. We'll go ahead and remove it too. In the center of it is a tiny, tiny hole. This controls your idle. So if you don't have an adjustable idle screw on your carburetor and you don't have a good idle, it's probably this thing right here. You need to do what we just did. You need to get that torch tip cleaner or a fine copper, like a part of a stranded wire. Take one strand out. You need to run down through there and make sure that that tiny little hole's cleaned out. We're in good shape here, so yeah, I'm gonna put it right back in. Don't over tighten it, just snug it. That brings us to the needle and seat. This float, we'll go over how that works. When this carburetor is in its normal operating condition, that float drops down. There's a needle hooked to it. It's like a valve that shuts off the flow of fuel that comes in from the fuel pump into this float bowl. So when the fuel fills that float bowl and the level rises, that float rises, and it shuts off that fuel. So if that float is stuck, again, like it's been sitting for a while and the float was up high, you know, and the gasoline turned to varnish and that float is stuck. I've seen that happen a lot. Then you're not going to get any gas flowing into your carburetor. So let's take this float and needle out. To do that, it's got a hinge pin right here that it just swivels on. So we just need to pull that out, which is going to be easier said than done probably. Not too bad. Put that down there, and the needle will just lift out. As a matter of fact, can you guys see down in there? You see that black piece sitting right down in there? That's a piece of debris. So even though this carburetor is working and this engine is running right, it's getting ready to have a problem. So see if I can get something and scrape that out of there. You don't want to damage this seat. That needle has a rubber tip on it. And that rubber sits down in that hole in this seat and makes a seal. So if you scratch this seat digging around in there, it's not going to seal and it's probably going to flood the carburetor. If I can move it, boy. Normally, I just use a blow nozzle and blow this out, but I'm trying to get it out in one piece, but I may not be able to. Yeah, it's gone. So there we go. So to put it back together, we're going to take our float. We've got our needle with that clip on it. I'm going to slide that clip up over that tab on the float, and it should just dangle there. Right like that. We're going to bring our carburetor up to it. I'm going to lower it down until that needle drops down in that well where the seat is. Right like that. We're going to get our hinge pin. Slide it through. We're going to give it just a little bit of a tap. It won't come out of there, but I want to make sure. All right, there it is. To test that, we're going to blow through it again, right where the hose that runs to the fuel pump goes on. All right, see there's no air coming because, well, let me turn it right side up. All right, we've got our float hooked to it. You can see it, it raises and drops with the level of fuel in the float bowl. If you blow through it with it down low, the float should be, or the needle should be off the seat and fuel should run into the carburetor. Yep, it sure does. But if I raise it, it shuts off the flow of fuel into the carburetor. So it's working just fine. It doesn't leak, should be in good shape. Here's that nozzle that I was talking about. It's got some holes in it. We want to get our torch tip cleaner again. We want to run through those holes. Make sure they're all open. Right like that. Yep. So do the same with every hole in it. Make sure they're open. Make sure the hole in the center is open. So we know the hose are clean. We're going to drop that nozzle right back down in the carburetor. Just the opposite of what we did to remove it. Just run it back down in there, being careful not to over tighten it, not to drag our screwdriver across those aluminum threads in the carburetor body. That would ruin your day. Just get it down there where it bottoms out and just make it snug right there. We know that main jet was good with that big hole in it, so we're going to replace it. There we go. That leaves that tiny main jet right here. Now this jet affects fuel flow at wide open throttle. So if you've got an engine that likes to surge at wide open throttle, this jet is a good thing to check. Make sure it's open, and that one is. It screws in the side. We'll snug it. I have seen these fall off in the float bowl because they weren't tight enough. The engine, of course, is super rich because it's just drinking raw fuel through that giant hole in that first jet we put in. They'll run, but black smoke, you can't get any power out of them. If you ever get a condition like that, check the main jet. Make sure it hadn't fallen off. I've seen it happen. And we will put our float bowl back on, orientating the bowl drain to the front of the carburetor. Put our nut or our fuel solenoid, depending on what we happen to have, back in place. Tighten it down. There we go. Now, I want to talk about this screw right here, this black piece on it. This is your idle mixture screw. It only comes into play when the engine is idling, and you can adjust it. You know, it turns, clockwise, leans the mixture out, turning it counterclockwise, richens the idle mixture up. So if you've got an engine idling and it wants to surge or it runs rough, you can always adjust this. You'll notice, I think you can see, that it only turns a half a turn. And this black cap, it's got this, it bumps up against it right here. And won't let it turn any further. That's called a limiter cap. It's put on there by the EPA. Actually, it's put on there by Kohler or Kawasaki or Briggs & Stratton or Honda or whoever the engine manufacturer is. But it's mandated by the EPA. They don't want you adjusting this, to get your engine out of emission compliance. But I'll show you what you can do, I think. Get a hold of that black cap with some pliers and work it off. Now, you'll notice that this is a strange shape. It's not slotted for a screwdriver. It's got two flat sides on it. I don't know if you can see that or not, and it's splined up there. It takes a special emission screwdriver to drop down over that and be able to turn it. And once you get it turned to where the engine runs appropriately, you're supposed to put that black limiter cap back on there to hold it in that position. I'll leave that up to you guys. There we go. So now it can only turn half a turn again. So our carburetor should be in good shape. Let's get it back on the engine, get this thing fired up. Installation obviously is the opposite of removal. We're going to start with these linkage rods. We'll try the throttle link. You see it's got a Z-bend on it. That's what they call that weird end right there. So we're going to start it in the hole, turn the carburetor body, and there it is. The hardest part of this whole procedure is hooking this spring back up. I'll try and get it out here where you can see it. There it is. It's a long wire spring. Its purpose is just to take up slop. You know, after a long time of being in this carburetor, these rods and this slot or this hole they go in get loose. The spring ensures that every little bit of movement down here is transmitted up here. It keeps everything tight together. Now, the throttle rod, I'm going to try and get it in. There we go. Don't forget to put your gasket back on. Settle it back up over the studs, push it home. Our gasket. Am I putting that on right? Nope. This gasket only goes on one way. See, it's got that little hole in it right there. It matches that hole right there. So get it orientated in the right direction, which I still don't have it. There we go, before you put it on. All right, let's get everything else back together. It's all back together now. Only thing left to do is to fire it up, make sure it still runs. Remember, there wasn't anything wrong with this when I took it apart, so hopefully it'll still run. Let's find out. Let's see the fuel on. Yeah, it runs just as good as it ever did. So, fortunately, it runs pretty good, which, you know, like I said, we expected it to. There wasn't anything wrong with it in the first place. I said at the beginning of this video that we wouldn't concentrate a whole lot on troubleshooting. We'd do that at the end, and we're going to. I'm going to find some shade, get somewhere where it's, you know, a little cooler, and we'll talk about some common non-starting or won't stay running issues that are fuel carburetor related. So for now, let's go get something to drink. I'll see you guys in a minute. So we've talked about our ignition system and how it relates to a non-starting, you know, condition on our small engines. What about the fuel system? You know, it's a lot easier to troubleshoot a fuel system if it will start and run a little bit, even if it runs bad. But if it won't start at all, the first thing I'm going to check is, do I have fresh fuel in the tank? You know, take the cap off, smell that fuel, maybe get a sample of it, see what it looks like. Is it green? Is it nasty? Has it got water in it? Water is huge. So, you know, make sure you got good, clean, fresh fuel in the tank, and then follow our steps that we laid out today. You know, start at the tank, work your way all the way down to the carburetor, and then if you have to go into the carburetor, you know what you're doing. If the engine will start, but it won't stay running, one of the hardest, you know, things you got to decide is, am I dealing with a spark issue or is it a fuel issue? Again, on our previous video, we talked about the ignition. We laid out some troubleshooting steps there. But if you're right there at the engine and it will start, but it runs poorly and maybe it dies or tries to die, one of the easiest things you can do is to reach in, close that choke a little bit. Reach in with your hands, close the choke. If it's an ignition issue, making the mixture richer won't matter. That engine will go ahead and die or continue faltering. But if it's a lean fuel mixture or a partially clogged carburetor and you reach in and you close that choke, it may smooth out. It may, run better, and that will point you in the direction. You'll know then that it's not a spark issue, it's a fuel issue. I'm going to have to, drop back and go through these steps that I laid out for you here today. Guys, I'm going to wrap it up and head to the house. Thanks for sticking with me this long. I know it's been kind of a jumbled up video. I hope you can take something away from it. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Our subscriber count is really coming up. We couldn't be more pleased, but we're not quite where we want to be yet. So if you could find your way fit to subscribe and hit that like button and maybe that notification bell, we'd greatly appreciate it. and tell your friends about us. Maybe they can, learn something here too. Again, we greatly appreciate it. Get outside. I always say that because it's true. Get outside and enjoy, what's out there. You'll be a better person for it. Remember to be nice to one another. We could use a lot more of that right now. Guys, I'm going to head home. I will see you on the next video.